Hey guys, uh, sorry, I just want to make sure that we're actually streaming, so I'm just going to pull up the stream because it tells me that there's an error message, but I suspect that we're actually live. And as soon as I just double check that we are actually live, then we will get started. So just bear with me for just a second. And apologies for the late start. There was actually a rally going on for in solidarity of the um, of the resistance that's going on in Palestine. So that was one of the reasons why I ended up needing to start the stream late. So sorry about that, but um, it was a very good event and it was a very strong turnout. So I'm happy to report that um, there's a very high turnout for um, in solidarity of the the struggle that's going on uh, out there. So very happy to see people showing their support uh, and just it it's reassuring because I mean with the BLM protests last year, there was every reason to believe that uh, you know things would die down this year and that people wouldn't be interested in going out into the streets and protesting for for you know human rights and uh, showing their support for um, people in need. And I'm glad to see that that's not the case. People have every bit of willingness to show their support, and we really need that. So if you see those things going on, then definitely do what you can to get out there and show your support. Um, do what you can to be a part of the struggle, be a part of the marches. Um, speak out, join the marches. Just do whatever you can to show some solidarity to people in need. Um, and yeah, that kind of stuff is very important. All right, so I pulled up the stream and it looks like we're doing all right. Um, so let's see. All right, so last week we went through a piece by Lenin on the three component parts of Marxism. We talked about um, I chose that piece because I thought that it was very important to talk about the philosophical basis for or underlying Marxism. And I wanted to make sure that we took some time to explore that before going into any of the bigger ideas. And we're still going to touch on those things. Those things are just going to come up, oh, regardless of what it is that we end up reading, because they're fundamental ideas to Marxism. They're going to come up in the text that we're going to read today, and or at least the text that we're going to start today. But uh, it's important uh, to at least lay the groundwork with those philosophical foundations because it at least sets the stage for what Marxism is and how it builds itself up from philosophy to creating a methodology for understanding the world. It is a sort of scientific endeavor, um, in that there's a methodology for ascertaining truth. And it's important to understand that because when you get to the level of um, what we're going to look at in today's text, so we're starting Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Fredrick Engels. When you start to look at uh, socialism, and not just socialism specifically, but when you start to look at anything that Marxist philosophy undertakes, it isn't simply an endeavor of um, you just set a goal and you just go for it. There's a methodology to it. There's a sort of so reviewing what we talked about last week. There was materialism. Materialism is the philosophical foundation for um, materialism is the philosophical foundation underlying Marxism. And we talked about how Marx took what was actually this wasn't included. I in the Spanish version of on the Spanish stream, we read a longer version of the text because I couldn't find the exact same version of the text. So I chose an analogous um, piece, but that one ended up being longer. And in that, it actually explains how Marx took a philosophical idea of materialism and using his contributions to materialism actually improved the philosophy in a way that made it more um, basically more complete and more comprehensive. He made it what is called dialectical materialism, which is the concept that things are always in motion. It looked at, uh, it takes the idea that what is to be understood is what is physically present, and it applies the understanding that things are in a constant state of change. So if we understand that things are in a constant state of change and understand that what is to be understood um, is in the physical reality, then we understand that there are physical forces acting on physical reality, and that allows us to take into account those changes in our observation so that we can understand things on um, we can understand things not just as a snapshot of what they are, but on the trajectory that they are over time. And that's important because it uh, it's important for us to understand that as observers, we have we have an impact on the object that we are observing. I'm not going to get too philosophical in getting into the Schrodinger's cat conundrum, but that's sort of where this sort of gets to. That's one of the places that this sort of gets to. But suffice it to say that it's important to understand that when we're observing physical reality, we have to take into account that things are in a state of motion, in a state of change, and um, that it behooves us to understand what those changes are and what those forces are that are imposing those changes on whatever it is that we're observing. So then the other thing that that Marx did was he applied this philosophy to history. And so he developed this thing called historical materialism. Um, and he understood the way that society developed over time. And that was what led him to understand the dynamics of capitalism, and eventually what led to his understanding of the inevitability of socialism. So, what we're going to look at today is a piece by Engels on socialism, utopian and scientific. And what Engels does in this piece is he talks about the transition from socialism being sort of this pie in the sky, hopeless dream that didn't really, um, it was never really something that was going to go anywhere because uh, it didn't have the um, it didn't have the it didn't have those contributions by Marx that we're outlining right now. Like there wasn't the materialism, the dialectical materialism, or the historical materialism in order to give it a scientific basis. But with um, with those aspects now in place, there is a scientific basis on which you can develop a scientific basis for socialism. So we'll see how there is a scientific basis for socialism um, as a as an inevitability as we go through Engels's prolific book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It's rather short. We'll see how far we get. We'll see if we can get through the first chapter of the book. Um, but yeah, this was one of the first books that I read on socialism, and it's very interesting. What I thoroughly enjoyed it when I first read it, so hopefully you guys will too. Okay, so chapter one: the development of utopian socialism. Modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between the proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers, on the other hand, of the anarchy existing in production. But in its theoretical form, modern socialism originally appears ostensibly as a more logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century. Like every new theory, modern socialism had, at first, to connect itself with the intellectual stock in trade ready to its hand, however deeply its roots lay in material economic facts. The great men who in France prepared men's minds for the coming revolution were themselves extreme revolutionists. They recognized no external authority of any kind whatever. Religion, natural science, society, political institutions, everything was subjected to the most unsparing criticism. Everything must justify its existence before the judgment seat of reason or give up existence. Reason became the sole measure of everything. It was the time when, as Hegel says, the world stood upon its head, first in the sense that the human head and the principles arrived at by its thought claimed to be the basis of all human action and association, but by and by also in the wider sense that the reality which was in contradiction to these principles had in fact to be turned upside down. Every form of society and government then existing, every old traditional notion, was flung into the lumber room as irrational. The world had hitherto allowed itself to be led solely by prejudices. Everything in the past deserved only pity and contempt. Now, for injustice, privilege, oppression were to be superseded by external truth, eternal right, equality based on nature, and the inalienable rights of man. We know today that the kingdom of reason was nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie, that the eternal right found its realization in bourgeois justice, that the equality reduced itself to bourgeois equality before the law, that bourgeois property was proclaimed as one of the essential rights of man, and that the government of reason, the contrat social of Rousseau, came into being and only could come into being as a democratic bourgeois republic. The great thinkers of the 18th century could no more than their predecessors go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch. But side by side were the antagonisms of the feudal nobility and the burghers, who claimed to represent the rest of society, was the general antagonism of exploiters and exploited, of rich idlers and poor workers. It was this very circumstance that made it possible for the representatives of the bourgeoisie to put themselves forward as representing not one special class, but the whole of suffering humanity. Still further, from its origin, the bourgeoisie was saddled with its antithesis. Capitalists cannot exist without wage workers, and the same proportion as the medieval burgher of the guild developed into the modern bourgeoisie. The guild journeymen and the day laborers outside the guilds developed into the proletarian. And although, upon the whole, the bourgeoisie, in their struggle with the nobility, could claim to represent at the same time the interests of the different working classes of that period, yet in every great bourgeois movement there were independent outbursts of that class which was the forerunner, more or less developed, of the modern proletariat. For example, at the time of the German Reformation and the Peasants' War, the Anabaptists and Thomas Munzer, and the Great English Revolution, the Levellers, and the Great French Revolution, Babeuf. These were theoretical enunciations corresponding with the revolutionary uprisings of a class not yet developed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, utopian pictures of ideal social conditions. In the 18th century, actual communistic theories. The demand for equality was no longer limited to political rights. It was extended also to the social conditions of individuals. It was not simply class privileges that were to be abolished, but class distinctions themselves. A communism, ascetic, denouncing all the pleasures of life, Spartan, was the first form of the new teaching. Then came the three great utopians, Saint Simon, to whom the middle class movement, side by side with the proletarian, still had a certain significance. Fourier and Owen, when the country where capitalist production was most developed, and under the influence of the antagonisms begotten of this, worked out his proposals for the removal of class distinction systematically and in direct relation to French materialism. One thing is common to all three. Not one of them appears as a representative of the interests of that proletariat which historical development had, in the meantime, produced. Like the French philosophers, they do not claim to emancipate a particular class to begin with, but all humanity at once. Like them, they wish to bring in the kingdom of reason and eternal justice, but this kingdom, as they see it, is as far as heaven from earth, from that of French philosophers. For to our three social reformers, the bourgeois world, based upon the principles of these philosophers, is quite as irrational and unjust, and therefore finds its way to the dust hole quite as readily as feudalism and all the earlier stages of society. If pure reason and justice have not hitherto ruled the world, this has been the case only because men have not rightly understood them. What was wanted was the individual man of genius, who has now arisen and who understands the truth. That he has now arisen, that the truth has now been clearly understood, is not an inevitable event, following of necessity in the chains of historical development, but a mere happy accident. He might just as well have been born 500 years earlier, and might have then have spared humanity 500 years of error, strife, and suffering. We saw how the French philosophers of the 18th century, the forerunners of the Revolution, appealed to reason as the sole judge of all that is. A rational movement, rational society, were to be founded. Everything that ran counter to eternal reason was to be remorselessly done away with. We saw also that the eternal reason was in reality nothing but this idealized understanding of the 18th century citizen, just then evolving into the bourgeois. The French Revolution had realized this rational society and government. But the new order of things, rationally enough as compared with earlier conditions, turned out to be by no means absolutely rational. The state based upon reason completely collapsed. Rousseau's Contrat Social had found its realization in the Reign of Terror, from which the bourgeoisie, who had lost confidence in their own political capacity, had taken refuge first in the corruption of the Directorate, and finally under the wing of the Napoleonic despotism. The promised eternal peace was turned into an endless war of conquest. The society based upon reason had fared no better. The antagonism between the rich and the poor, instead of dissolving into general prosperity, had become intensified by the removal of the guild and the other privileges which had to some extent bridged it over, and by the removal of the charitable institutions of the church. The freedom of property from the feudal fetters, now veritably accomplished, turned out to be, for the small capitalist and small proprietors, the freedom to sell their small property, crushed under the overmastering competition of the large capitalists and landlords to these great lords, and thus, as far as the small capitalists and peasant proprietors were concerned, became freedom from property. The development of industry upon a capitalist basis made poverty and misery of the working masses conditions of existence of society. Cash payment became more and more, in Carlyle's phrase, the sole nexus between man and man. The number of crimes increased from year to year.
Formerly, the feudal vices had openly stalked about in broad daylight. Though not eradicated, they were now, at any rate, thrust into the background. In their stead, the bourgeois vices, hitherto practiced in secret, began to blossom all the more luxuriantly. Trade became to a greater and greater extent cheating. The fraternity of the revolutionary motto was realized in the chicanery and rivalries of the battle of competition. Oppression by force was replaced by corruption, the sword, as the first social lever, by gold. The right of the first knight was transferred from the feudal lords to the bourgeois manufacturers. Prostitution increased to an extent never heard of. Marriage itself remained as before the legally recognized form. The official out the official cloak of prostitution, and moreover was supplemented by rich crops of adultery. In a word, compared with the splendid promises of the philosophers, the social and political institutions, born of the triumph of reason, were bitterly disappointing caricatures. All that was wanting was the men to formulate the disappointment, and they came with the turn of the century. In 1802, St. Simon's Geneva Letters appeared. In 1808 appeared Fourier's first work. Although the groundwork of his theory dated from 1799, on January 1st, 1800, Robert Owen undertook the direction of New Lanark.
Bear with me for a second, guys. Sorry about that. At this time, however, the capitalist mode of production, and with it the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, still very incompletely developed. Modern industry, which had just arisen in England, was still unknown in France. But modern industry develops, on the one hand, and conflicts with which make a but modern industry develops, on the one hand, the conflicts which make absolutely necessary a revolution in the mode of production, and the doing away with with its capitalistic character. Conflicts do not only conflicts not only between the classes begotten of it, but also between the very productive forces and the forms of exchange created by it. And on the other hand, it develops in these very gigantic productive forces.
If, therefore, about the year 1800, the conflicts arising from the new social order were only just beginning to take shape, this holds still more fully as the means of ending them. The have-nothing masses of Paris, during the Reign of Terror, were able for a moment to gain the mastery and thus to lead the bourgeois revolution to victory, in spite of the bourgeois themselves. But in doing so, they only proved how impossible it was for their domination to last under the conditions then obtaining. The proletariat, which then, for the first time, evolved itself from the have-nothing masses as the nucleus of a new class, as yet incapable of independent political action, appeared as an oppressed suffering order, to whom, in its capacity to help itself, help could, at best, be brought in from without or down from above.
Alright, guys, I think I'm going to cut it here because I'm noticing some issues with the stream. I keep getting an error message both on my page and on the streaming page. So I'm sorry if you guys aren't experiencing any issues, but I'm getting some error messages, and yeah, I don't want to think that I'm doing all right, and then it turns out that it's not actually streaming all right. So what I'll do is yeah, I think I'm gonna call it a night um for now, and we'll pick back up next week. Sorry about that, guys. I hope you understand. But I appreciate you guys, you know, sticking sticking with me, and we'll give it another shot next week. We'll see if I can do something about the issues, but hopefully next week we'll get those resolved. But in any case, thanks a lot, and you guys have a good one.